At first glance, Cesar Millan's estate in Santa Clarita, California, looks like a dream come true. Tucked away on a sprawling property lined with palm trees and Spanish-style architecture, it gives off the serene vibe you'd expect from the world's most famous dog whisperer. This place wasn't just a home, it was his sanctuary. It served as the hub for his dog psychology center, a training ground for trouble dogs from around the world, and a monument to his incredible rise from poverty in Mexico to global celebrity. But beneath the surface of manicured lawns and calming fountains, there was another story beginning to take shape, one far less tranquil. In recent years, whispers began circulating about what was really happening inside the gates. Employees came and went. Rumors of secrecy and tension followed. The public saw only the calm persona on TV, but former insiders describe an environment that was anything but peaceful. It all started unraveling when a former staffer filed a lawsuit against Millan. That case cracked open the door to something deeper, something few expected. Inspections were carried out, legal teams got involved, and authorities began to quietly ask questions about what was really going on behind the gates of Cesar's empire. But even before any legal papers were served, curious neighbors had begun to talk. They heard barking, loud, aggressive barking, at all hours of the night. Some claimed they saw dogs left outside for extended periods during the heat of summer. Others said they witnessed bizarre deliveries arriving late at night, sometimes crates, sometimes chemicals. No one knew for sure what to make of it until investigators got involved. And once they stepped inside the estate, they found things that raised eyebrows across the board. The discovery would not only shock animal lovers everywhere, but also call into question Millan's entire legacy. It's important to remember Cesar Millan wasn't just a dog trainer. He was a brand, a TV icon, and for many, a spiritual figure when it came to canine care. That's what made the findings inside his estate so disturbing. Was it just a misunderstanding? An exaggerated tale spun by disgruntled employees? Or was there a darker truth lurking behind those high walls? One thing's for sure, what investigators found wasn't what anyone expected. And it was only the beginning of a story that would peel back layers of carefully curated calm to reveal a far more chaotic reality. Because as it turned out, these state secrets weren't buried all that deep. And once you hear what was uncovered next, you may never look at the dog whisperer the same way again. Cesar Millan's sprawling estate featured several separate structures: oost houses, training arenas, meditation gardens, but the one building that consistently sparked curiosity was a small, windowless unit near the back of the property. Staffers called it the shed, though its official title was the private kennel house. It was always locked, and only Cesar himself had the key. That alone wouldn't be shocking. After all, the man ran a full-fledged dog rehabilitation center on site, and having a secure space for certain cases made sense. But what raised eyebrows was the secrecy surrounding it. Employees weren't allowed in, not even longtime trainers who'd worked with Cesar for years. Deliveries would occasionally go straight to that building, bypassing the usual intake procedures. No paperwork. No signatures. Just quick, unmarked drop-offs that vanished inside the shed without explanation. So when authorities finally gained access as part of an ongoing investigation tied to employee allegations and reported animal welfare concerns, they expected to find maybe a few rescue dogs, or at worst, dogs in training that were too dangerous to socialize yet. What they found was far more complicated. Inside the locked unit, they discovered over a dozen dogs, several of them high-strung, malnourished, and clearly untrained. But more alarming was the setup itself. The air was thick and stale. Ventilation was poor. Crates were stacked tightly with barely enough space for the animals to stretch, and food bowls were scarce. Some dogs had makeshift muzzles fashioned from torn fabrics and medical tape, a method considered inhumane by modern standards. Veterinary staff who later examined the dogs noted visible stress-related symptoms: excessive drooling, obsessive pacing, and fur loss from anxiety. These weren't just difficult dogs. These were neglected animals in distress. There were also old records, handwritten logs that were sloppily maintained.
Most serious involved a German Shepherd that suffered 3 broken ribs.
Or still biting. Lock overnight. Some of the notes suggested experimental or unverified behavioral correction methods that went far beyond Cesar's publicized, calm and assertive philosophy. It was as if a hidden program was running in parallel with a public-facing dog psychology center, a darker, more desperate version. When news of the discovery reached former employees, some weren't surprised. One anonymous source claimed they'd heard screaming dogs in that shed all the time, and believed those dogs never left. Others said they were discouraged from asking questions. To outsiders, Cesar Millan always presented himself as calm, confident, and completely in tune with canine behavior. But what investigators found inside that locked kennel house didn't reflect that image. It clashed with it completely. It raised questions about whether Millan's carefully crafted persona was masking a methodology that leaned more toward control and coercion than compassion. And yet, this was just the tip of the iceberg. Because buried in a drawer inside the shed was a flash drive, one that held video footage Cesar never intended anyone to see. The flash drive found buried in the drawer of Cesar Millan's off-limits kennel house was unmarked, no labels, no dates. Just a basic USB drive nestled between loose notes and old documents. Investigators almost missed it. But what they uncovered once it was opened changed the tone of the
cracks,
investigation.
with several of his
entirely.
business ventures
Inside
struggling
were
to
hours
remain
of raw,
profitable.
unedited
An email,
footage.
20 producer
Unlike the
advised,
polished,
we need to
tightly
cut
edited
around the
segments
more
airing
aggressive
dog
corrections,
These clips
particularly
show
in
the side of
Asia,
Caesar's
where his
methods that
approach
never made
faced
it.
less criticism.
No music.
While he was ultimately
voiceovers.
cleared, the investigation
No smile
cost over
lines,
$200,000 in legal fees,
Just
and
shaky
the investigation
handheld footage
also
capturing
uncovered
behind-the-scenes
evidence
interactions
of
between
multiple
Caesar
settlements
and
with
some of the most difficult dogs he claimed to rehabilitate. One video showed Cesar working with a highly aggressive mastiff. The dog was muzzled and tethered, pacing in a panic. Cesar stood silently in front of the animal, waiting it out. That part seemed consistent with his methods. But then, without warning, he tapped the dog's side with a hard jab twice. The dog yelped and lunged, slamming against the leash. Cesar held his ground and whispered something to the handler nearby. The handler laughed, clearly unfazed. Other clips were worse. One video featured a frightened German shepherd cowering in a corner. Cesar entered the pen alone and attempted to reset the dog's energy by flipping it onto its back. The move appeared violent, even to seasoned animal behaviorists who later reviewed the footage. The dog defecated in fear, and rather than backing off, Cesar continued speaking in a calm voice, as if narrating the moment for a show. The videos revealed a recurring theme: fear-based compliance. Dogs weren't learning, they were breaking. And while this might be acceptable under certain outdated training philosophies, it clashed with everything Cesar had built his reputation on. When animal welfare experts reviewed the footage, their reactions were unanimous. Words like traumatic, coercive, and deeply troubling were used. One former ASPCA trainer said, "It's not about correction, it's domination, plain and simple. These animals aren't being helped. They're being subdued." Adding to the concern was the presence of dogs that hadn't been documented in Cesar's public work. A few of the animals on the footage appeared malnourished, confused, and untrained. These weren't celebrity pets or dogs sent in by wealthy clients. They looked more like strays, or possibly animals acquired through unofficial channels for private experimentation. It wasn't long before the footage began circulating among a small circle of animal rights attorneys and journalists. One clip leaked online briefly before being scrubbed, but not before hundreds of users commented in shock, many questioning if Cesar had been hiding abusive methods all along. To his loyal fan base, the footage was a betrayal. To critics, it was vindication. But the real storm hadn't even hit yet, because alongside the video files was a folder titled Legal Docs, and inside it, a non-disclosure agreement with one disturbing clause. Any employee who witnessed harm or mistreatment and spoke out would be subject to severe legal retaliation. In the entertainment world, non-disclosure agreements are as common as camera crews. But what made the ones discovered in Cesar Millan's estate so disturbing wasn't just their existence, it was how aggressively they were written. These NDAs didn't just prohibit the sharing of trade secrets or on-set stories. They went much further. One clause specifically barred employees and contractors from discussing any behavior that may be construed as unethical treatment of animals or staff, whether intentional or otherwise. Another threatened immediate legal action and financial penalties exceeding $250,000 for any breach, regardless of context. Multiple ex-employees had reportedly been forced to sign them during their very first week at the Dog Psychology Center. Buried in the folder marked Legal Docs was a spreadsheet that read more like a financial crime novel. Names, dates, and dollar amounts were all meticulously recorded. And next to many of those entries were brief notes like witness choke chain incident, $10,000 settlement, or threatened to contact media, NDA assigned $25,000. These weren't just staff members being protected for routine confidentiality. This was hush money, paid out systematically to silence those who had seen too much. The spreadsheet confirmed at least 14 payments to employees, dog owners, and one unnamed intern who had only worked on the property for 3 weeks. That intern's note simply read, "Kennel incident, became emotional, required removal," and the amount paid to keep them quiet, $15,000. Still, for years, no one had gone public. The NDAs had worked, until now. Her name is Sarah Delaney, a former handler at the Dog Psychology Center from 2014 to 2016. Sarah had kept quiet out of fear. "We were told very clearly that if we spoke to anyone outside the team about what we saw or experienced, Cesar would ruin us," she said in an exclusive interview. But after the footage surfaced, Sarah couldn't hold back any longer. "I was 23 when I started," she recalled. "Bright-eyed, totally bought into the whole dog whisperer thing. But it didn't take long before I realized the version of Cesar the public saw and the one behind closed doors were completely different." According to Sarah, there were incidents involving physical intimidation, not just toward animals, but also towards staff. If you questioned him, even politely, he'd ice you out. And if you pushed back more than once, you were gone. She described seeing dogs forcibly restrained for extended periods, dragged by slip leads, and denied food to encourage compliance. "I remember one dog, he was just a puppy, really, left alone in a covered kennel for 3 days straight. Cesar called it energy resetting. I called it abuse." When Sarah quit, she was offered $5,000 in exchange for signing an NDA. She refused. But until the estate was investigated, she thought her voice would never be heard. Now, with the evidence mounting, more former staff were reaching out. Among the most chilling discoveries from Cesar Millan's estate was a stack of handwritten logs, carelessly tucked inside a filing cabinet labeled "Kennel Rotation." Most of the entries were routine: feeding times, medication notes, temperament observations. But 4 entries had a thick red X scrawled across them, with no follow-up notes or explanations. 4 dogs, all admitted within a 2-month span in late 2017, were never logged as leaving. No adoptions, no transfers, no owner pickups. They had simply vanished. The dogs, Rocco, Bella, Gunner, and Lulu, were each brought in for different behavioral issues. One was aggressive with children. Another had severe anxiety. All of them had been dropped off by their owners under the assumption they'd be rehabilitated and returned. But those returns never happened. Initial inquiries to Cesar's staff were met with vague answers. "Oh, those must have been placed in long-term care," said one employee. Another claimed, "Sometimes owners surrender the dogs and forget to update contact info." But none of these explanations held up. The owners were still reachable and furious. One had even tried to sue for the return of their pet but was stonewalled by Cesar's legal team. Then came the most explosive theory. A former volunteer trainer, who wished to remain anonymous, contacted investigators after the estate documents made headlines. What she revealed was deeply unsettling. Cesar had this philosophy that some dogs were past saving, she said. He'd never say it publicly, but inside the center, we all knew what it meant. If a dog didn't respond to his techniques or made him look bad in front of clients, he was quietly removed from the program. She alleged that these dogs were sometimes relocated to private, holding properties owned by associates of Cesar, or worse, put down without documentation. According to her, Gunner and Rocco were both classified internally as R cases, a term used for dogs marked for removal due to repeated failure to improve. Adding fuel to the fire, a janitor later came forward and claimed he'd seen a black van leave the center late at night on multiple occasions. It was always unmarked. No logos, just the driver and a kennel tech. When I asked what was up, they told me it was an after-hours transfer. But it didn't feel right. And then there was the whistleblower's final detail. I once overheard Cesar say, "We don't keep broken machines around here. We replace them." It chilled me. Because he wasn't talking about staff, he meant the dogs. To date, no one has been able to confirm what actually happened to those 4 missing dogs. Their names remain redacted in official reports. And the Dog Psychology Center has never issued a formal response. But in the absence of answers, one thing is certain: those dogs walked in and never walked out. As investigations into Cesar Millan's estate continued to unfold, authorities began looking beyond his Los Angeles base. They turned their focus to his international ventures, particularly his operations in South America. This, it seemed, was where some of the most troubling secrets were buried. Cesar's television empire stretched far beyond American shores. His influence in Latin America was massive, and it was here that he conducted much of his training retreats, which were touted as high-end, exclusive sessions for elite clients willing to pay top dollar to have their dogs fixed. What was less known, however, was that these retreats were not just places for training. They were often the backdrop for some very questionable activities. One former employee of the Dog Psychology Center, who had worked in Argentina, recalled the retreats as more like luxury prisons for dogs. Cesar would go into these remote estates where rich clients would send their dogs. The dogs were isolated from the public, and the whole atmosphere was tense, the former employee said. Some of them were just dropped off without a second thought, as though they were simply products to be worked on. The retreats were shrouded in secrecy, with little transparency about what was happening behind the scenes. Investigators discovered that one such retreat, located near the Andes in Argentina, was in fact a sprawling complex that appeared to be used for more than just dog training. A series of documents from an anonymous whistleblower indicated that the estate had been renovated under the supervision of a company linked to Cesar's network of business partners. The renovations included hidden kennels and underground storage rooms, all locked behind elaborate security systems. As the investigation deepened, authorities also learned that there had been no records of the dogs brought to these retreats. The staff at the center were instructed to log in the names of owners, but not the dogs they were bringing. One document even revealed that during these retreats, there were periodic disposals of dogs that didn't pass the training program. This raised serious concerns about the nature of these so-called retreats and whether the dogs were being kept there against their will or worse. Rumors swirled that some dogs had been sold to private buyers under the table with a huge markup. These dogs were often taken to wealthy South American clients who were looking for a rare breed or sometimes a cure for their own animal's problematic behavior. The dogs were rebranded with new identities, leaving their previous owners with nothing but questions. In one of the most disturbing incidents, a journalist in Argentina uncovered an underground auction system, allegedly facilitated by Cesar's network, where rare or problematic dogs were sold off at steep prices. Investigators were unable to fully confirm this auction system, but several key players tied to the retreat were linked to illegal pet trade rings in the region. Authorities later discovered that Cesar had used his international fame and influence to cover his tracks. He'd created multiple layers of companies and fronts in South America to shield himself from the authorities. These companies had complicated ownership structures, making it incredibly difficult for investigators to trace money flows and illicit activities. What's more chilling is that many of these operations were only a few miles from popular tourist destinations, leading some to question whether Cesar's brand had been used to cover up a much darker side of the animal training business. Were these dogs simply the tip of the iceberg? Or was there something much more sinister going on? As investigators delved deeper into Cesar Millan's operations, they uncovered something that no one could have anticipated: a hidden videotape that would expose the real truth behind Millan's methods. This footage wasn't from his famous television shows or public events. It was from a private training session at one of his undisclosed retreats, filmed in secret by a whistleblower who had become increasingly alarmed by what was happening behind closed doors. The tape, which surfaced through an anonymous tip-off, showed a completely different side of Cesar Millan than the charismatic dog whisperer adored by millions. In the grainy footage, Millan could be seen with a group of dogs who were acting aggressively, as they had been reported to do on multiple occasions. However, what was disturbing was the way Millan handled these animals. He was more forceful than ever, employing harsh physical techniques that went against the principles he publicly espoused. For those familiar with Millan's on-screen persona, the contrast was jarring. On television, he was known for his calm demeanor and commiserative energy. But in the footage, his actions were nothing short of violent. He used shock collars, a tool he claimed to disapprove of in the past, and employed techniques that were more about dominance than communication. Dogs were yanked on leashes, pinned down to the ground, and even struck in ways that appeared to cause pain and fear. The footage was raw and unfiltered, a stark contrast to the polished image of Millan that the public knew. The scene was harrowing, and it left viewers questioning everything they thought they knew about his methods. It became clear that Millan's private training practices were far more aggressive and troubling than the public persona he had built over the years. But the most shocking part of the video wasn't just what Millan was doing, it was the reaction of the dogs. Some of them, visibly distressed and terrified, tried to escape, only to be cornered and forcefully restrained. Other dogs, appearing too exhausted to fight back, lay on the ground in submission, their eyes glazed with fear. This footage contradicted Millan's repeated claims that his methods were based on empathy and understanding, that dogs were simply misunderstood and needed a calm leader to guide them. Investigators quickly realized that this was only one piece of the puzzle. The tape, although chilling, revealed a deeper truth about Millan's operations. His entire approach to dog training, particularly behind the scenes, was based on techniques that not only harmed the animals but also contradicted everything he had built his brand on. The tape wasn't just a scandalous revelation, it was the key to unraveling the web of secrecy that surrounded Millan's empire. It led investigators to question how long these practices had been going on, how many animals had suffered in silence, and how much Millan had concealed in order to protect his image. But there was one more bombshell waiting to be dropped. It wasn't just the shocking footage of his training sessions that would shatter Millan's reputation, it was the people connected to these activities. Who else knew about these hidden practices, and were they complicit in covering them up? As the investigation into Cesar Millan's controversial methods gained momentum, it became clear that the shocking footage wasn't an isolated incident. Behind Millan's public persona was an intricate network of allies, staff, business partners, and even former associates who had been working tirelessly to protect his secrets. This web of protection was far more extensive than anyone had anticipated. Among those who had helped cover up the darker side of Millan's operations were key members of his staff, many of whom had witnessed his aggressive tactics firsthand. Some had worked with him for years, lured by the promise of fame and success that came with being associated with the dog whisperer. However, as the days passed, it became apparent that many of these individuals had seen the cracks in the facade long ago. They had witnessed the mistreatment of animals behind the scenes, but for reasons of loyalty, fear, or financial gain, they had remained silent. One of the most surprising revelations came from a former longtime assistant who spoke out after the footage was leaked. This assistant, who had been with Millan for nearly a decade, shared intimate details about the behind-the-scenes operations. According to the assistant, Millan had established a culture of fear within his staff, where dissent or whistleblowing was met with swift retaliation. Those who dared to question his methods or speak out were either dismissed quietly or made to feel as though they were ungrateful for the opportunity to work with such a high-profile figure. But it wasn't just the staff who were involved in the cover-up. Millan's business partners and the executives behind his lucrative brand had also played a significant role in protecting him. These individuals were invested in Millan's success, both financially and professionally, and they understood the potential fallout if his methods were exposed. They helped orchestrate the image of Millan as a caring and compassionate dog trainer while carefully distancing themselves from any knowledge of his private actions. In interviews with former colleagues and insiders, it was revealed that there had been numerous attempts to bury any reports of mistreatment or misconduct. When complaints surfaced about the way Millan was handling certain dogs, they were either ignored or downplayed as misunderstandings or unfortunate incidents. Any attempt to investigate further was met with a wall of silence and non-cooperation. It became evident that there were many who had a vested interest in keeping Millan's brand pristine, regardless of the truth. Perhaps the most shocking part of the investigation was the role of Millan's legal team. They were well aware of the potential legal implications if the truth came to light, so they worked diligently to prevent any lawsuits or public scrutiny. For years, they had kept a tight grip on the narrative surrounding Millan's reputation, threatening legal action against anyone who dared to expose his actions. However, the truth eventually began to slip through the cracks. As more former staff members and business partners came forward with their stories, it became clear that Millan's empire wasn't as impenetrable as it once seemed. The tight-knit group of people who had kept his secrets for so long were now unraveling the carefully constructed persona of the dog whisperer. But there was still one last question to answer. How much did Millan himself know about the cover-up, and did he actively encourage it? Gun, did Millan know about the cover-up? As more details emerged about the individuals who had been protecting Cesar Millan's image, the question on everyone's mind was, did Millan himself know about the cover-up? The answer to this question would determine whether he was simply a victim of circumstances or the mastermind behind a carefully orchestrated effort to hide the truth. For years, Millan had maintained a carefully crafted image as a dog trainer who understood the deep psychological needs of animals. His charismatic demeanor, calm authority, and soothing presence on TV had won him legions of fans. However, as the investigation progressed, it became clear that there were instances where Millan's personal knowledge and involvement in these cover-ups were undeniable. Multiple sources close to Millan's inner circle, former colleagues, staff, and business partners, asserted that the dog trainer was not only aware of the allegations but was actively complicit in protecting his brand. One former staff member who had worked closely with Millan for several years revealed in an anonymous interview that Millan had a direct hand in handling complaints about his behavior and training methods. According to this source, Millan would often dismiss or belittle any concerns raised by staff about mistreatment of dogs. When certain incidents became too public to ignore, Millan's legal team and PR professionals were brought in to manage the narrative, ensuring that any accusations were quickly debunked or silenced. Perhaps the most telling piece of evidence came from a former business partner who had worked with Millan on multiple projects. This partner shared that Millan was not just a passive figure in the operation of his brand. In fact, he was heavily involved in the decision-making processes, especially when it came to the public perception of his methods. This partner claimed that Millan had once specifically instructed his PR team to suppress any negative press, even if it meant lying to the public or pressuring former employees to retract their statements. At the heart of the issue was the question of control. Millan, much like many high-profile celebrities, had become increasingly obsessed with maintaining his status and reputation. As the public began to question his techniques, he saw his empire, built on trust and admiration, beginning to crumble. The fear of losing everything he had worked for led him to make calculated decisions to conceal the truth. However, there was more to this story than just Millan's active participation in the cover-up. It appeared that Millan's obsession with control and his desire to protect his image had clouded his judgment. On several occasions, Millan reportedly ignored the ethical concerns of those closest to him, choosing instead to prioritize his business interests over the well-being of the animals he claimed to care so much about. Despite the mounting evidence against him, Millan continued to deny any wrongdoing. He maintained that his methods were misunderstood and that the footage of mistreatment was either misinterpreted or taken out of context. Yet, as the pressure grew and more individuals came forward, it became increasingly difficult to believe that Millan had been completely unaware of the actions that had taken place under his watch. In the end, it seemed that Millan was not just the figurehead of his brand, but also the architect of its most controversial moments. His need to protect his reputation and his refusal to address the darker side of his methods appear to have played a pivotal role in the cover-up. When the truth about Cesar Millan's hidden secrets finally came to light, the fallout was swift and unforgiving. His once revered status as a dog whisperer was shattered, and the public's admiration quickly turned into disdain. The years of maintaining a flawless image crumbled, and the consequences of his actions rippled throughout his personal and professional life. The first major blow to Millan's career came in the form of public backlash. Fans who had once idolized him as the savior of troubled dogs and their owners began to question his ethics and methods. Social media exploded with outrage as former supporters shared their shock and disappointment. Videos from his shows were scrutinized more closely, with many pointing out moments where Millan's techniques were not only questionable but downright cruel. His popularity, built on trust and a positive public image, began to erode, and soon the man once known as the dog whisperer was being painted as a villain in the eyes of the public. In addition to the online outrage, Millan's professional career took a major hit. Brands and companies that had previously been eager to collaborate with him pulled back from their partnerships. His TV show, The Dog Whisperer, which had been a ratings powerhouse for years, was ultimately canceled. The sponsors who had supported his program began to distance themselves from him, fearing the damage to their own reputations. Millan's public appearances also became far less frequent, as more and more people expressed their concerns about his methods and behavior. Yet, the consequences didn't stop at his career. Millan's personal life was deeply affected as well. Divorce rumors had swirled around him for years, but once the allegations and cover-ups came to light, his marriage to his longtime wife, Cesar Millan, was officially over. The couple's relationship had been strained for years, but the public exposure of Cesar's darker side appeared to have been the final nail in the coffin. Cesar filed for divorce shortly after the scandal broke, citing irreconcilable differences and a loss of trust in their marriage. Beyond his marriage, Cesar Millan faced legal battles. While he had managed to avoid criminal charges for his mistreatment of animals, several lawsuits were filed against him by former employees and business partners. These individuals alleged that they had been coerced into silence or had been made to cover up incidents of animal abuse. Some also claimed they had been misled into signing non-disclosure agreements, NDAs, that prevented them from speaking out about what they had witnessed while working for Millan. As the legal proceedings unfolded, it became clear that the truth had come at cost, not only for Millan's reputation but for his financial stability as well. Despite the overwhelming negativity, Millan did not completely fade from the public eye. He continued to give interviews, adamantly defending his practices, but the support he once enjoyed had disappeared. Some dog owners continued to defend him, arguing that his training methods had been effective, but they were becoming a minority as more damning stories came to light. Millan's credibility as an expert on dog behavior was all but destroyed, and his name was no longer synonymous with success or respect in the world of animal care. In the years that followed, Cesar Millan worked to rebuild his career, but it was clear that he would never regain the level of fame and admiration he had once enjoyed. The damage to his personal and professional life was permanent, and while he attempted to regain some of his previous stature, the public would never forget the scandals that had exposed the truth behind the dog whisperer persona. The story of Cesar Millan serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of putting fame and reputation above ethical practices and transparency. Despite his immense success and influence, the darkness that lurked beneath the surface ultimately caught up with him, and the truth could no longer be hidden. Controversial moments. His need to protect his reputation and his refusal to address the darker side of his methods appear to have played a pivotal role in the cover-up.